so passionate about dyslexia is because of being a dyslexic person myself. I feel like I really understand that we have a responsibility to change the narrative.
Everything she believed about herself was about to collapse. And when the DNA results surfaced, Princess Beatrice's entire world came undone. Whispers had always lingered in the corridors of the palace, whispers so soft they almost seemed harmless until they weren't. At first, they were nothing more than gossip, passed in hushed tones by aides and courtiers. But this time, the whispers carried weight. They spoke of a confidential DNA test, a test that no one was supposed to know about, but somehow everyone did. The rumors grew, spreading through royal circles like wildfire, impossible to put out. And at the center of it all stood Princess Beatrice, who had no idea that her name, her very identity, was being dissected behind closed doors. Insiders later confirmed what many feared, that the test had indeed been performed, its results impossible to ignore. The comparison between Beatrice and Prince Andrew yielded a discrepancy, a contradiction so glaring it couldn't be brushed off as clerical error or royal rumor. What it uncovered struck at the heart of her existence, threatening to unravel everything she thought she knew about herself. Suddenly, her place within the royal lineage appeared fragile, her bloodline questionable. The whispers gave way to quiet stars, and behind every polite smile lurked a question no one dared speak aloud. Who was she really? And what would happen if the world found out? In a move that shocked even the most seasoned royal observers, the palace decided to remain silent. Not a word of confirmation, not a single denial, no reassurance to quiet the swelling storm. Instead, they watched as the speculation mounted, the silence fueling curiosity and suspicion, until it became deafening. Every second of restraint from the crown only magnified the scandal, making the truth feel inevitable, unstoppable. And then came the moment no one could unsee. Beatrice was spotted leaving a secluded country estate, her face ashen, her eyes puffy from crying, clutching a folded envelope in her trembling hand. Those who were there that day swear the envelope was the report everyone had been whispering about, the one no one had yet dared to show her. And now, finally, she had read it, alone, unprepared. It was as if the weight of centuries had come crashing down upon her shoulders in that instant. She was no longer the radiant princess people thought they knew. She was a woman whose name, her history, and her very sense of self had been shattered by a single piece of paper. The royal calm she had perfected for years could no longer mask her devastation. Every step she took back to the estate felt heavier than the last, and with each passing moment, it became clearer. Something inside her had irreparably changed. But the test was just the beginning. The silence that followed would echo louder than any royal statement ever could. Behind the heavy palace doors, a daughter's tears spoke the truth no title ever could. In the hours after Beatrice returned to the estate, the weight of the envelope seemed to press against her every thought, every breath. She retreated to her room without a word, her silence sharper than any scream. The staff, though trained to maintain composure through decades of royal crises, found themselves unsettled. Quiet orders were given not to disturb her, and the corridors outside her door became still as stone. But even walls could not muffle the sound of her sobbing, a raw, unrestrained grief that rattled the servants and left them whispering to each other in the shadows. Alone with the truth she never wanted, Beatrice's world had become unrecognizable. She questioned everything at once: her name, her father, her place in the family she'd devoted her life to. Memories once cherished now felt foreign. The photographs lining her room mocked her, moments that now seemed staged on a stage she no longer belonged to. Her cries carried through the house, echoing off the marble, each one more desperate than the last. How could this be? She repeated into the silence, as if demanding an answer from the ghosts of those who'd kept the secret all these years. The breakdown didn't stay hidden long. Whispers of her devastation spread quickly, reaching ears that weren't supposed to hear. Courtiers traded glances in meetings. Journalists sharpened their pens, and headlines began to bloom like dark flowers in the tabloids. Yet the palace clung to its silence, refusing to confirm or deny anything. That silence, once a weapon of royal control, now betrayed the cracks forming behind the gilded facade. It only fueled the curiosity of the press and the fury of the public, who began to demand answers the crown seemed incapable or unwilling to give. For the first time, the people questioned not only the integrity of one princess, but of the entire institution that had shaped her life. Beatrice's pain was no longer private. It had become a symbol of something much larger, something the palace couldn't contain. And still, no one came to comfort her. No one came to explain. Yet the answers weren't locked in Buckingham's vaults. They were buried in a past Sarah Ferguson hoped would never return. Before there was Beatrice, there was a Texan businessman and a secret Sarah never planned to unearth. Long before the DNA test exposed what the palace tried to bury, whispers about Sarah Ferguson's loyalty had already stained the royal walls. During her turbulent marriage to Andrew, Sarah often escaped the suffocating halls of Buckingham and found herself drawn to someone entirely outside the royal script. A dark-haired Texan, wealthy and charismatic, became her quiet refuge, someone she laughed with, someone who seemed to understand her in ways her husband never did. In those days, their friendship was dismissed by many as harmless, a rebellious duchess playing with fire, but never daring to let it burn. But as the years passed and old photographs resurfaced, the resemblance between that man and Beatrice became harder to ignore. Friends who once joked about it now fell silent, their eyes darting away when her name was mentioned. What once passed as cruel humor began to feel like a dark premonition. And with the DNA revelation, those jokes hardened into suspicions that refused to die. The timing of Sarah's closeness to the Texan overlapped almost perfectly with the months before Beatrice was born, a detail the royal family desperately hoped would remain hidden. Sarah's silence during this chapter of her life only deepened the intrigue. Whenever journalists dared to ask about that period, she would deflect, sometimes with charm, other times with visible irritation. In her memoirs, there were hints of regret, fleeting lines that seemed to confess more than she intended. Words about choices she made to protect her daughters, about mistakes that haunted her, and about a love she once felt but could never name. Her public demeanor, always warm and approachable, could not mask the shadow behind her eyes when questioned about those years. There was guilt there, and more than guilt, fear. Fear that the truth she had buried decades earlier would one day rise and engulf her daughter. The palace could deny it all they wanted, but Sarah's own words painted a picture of a woman who had carried a secret too heavy for too long. And now, as headlines roared and the monarchy teetered on scandal, those secrets were no longer hers alone. The world demanded answers, and Sarah found herself at the center of a storm she could no longer outrun. Every glance cast her way, every murmur in the press, tightened the noose around her fragile silence. As eyes turned to Sarah, the bond between Beatrice and Andrew, once unshakable, began to quietly unravel. A single glance told the story. Beatrice no longer looked at Andrew the same way. Where once there had been warmth and devotion, now there was something brittle, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. In their rare public appearances since the DNA revelation, the distance between them was glaring. Beatrice stood with her arms crossed, her gaze fixed elsewhere, her smile thin and fleeting. Andrew, who once stood as her greatest protector, now looked diminished at her side, as though unsure how to reach her anymore. To the trained eyes of royal watchers, her demeanor spoke volumes. The affectionate daughter, who for years had walked beside her father through scandal and scrutiny, now appeared cold, even guarded. At ceremonies where they once exchanged knowing glances and quiet words, she stood stiff, her face composed but unreadable. Each time he tried to catch her eye, she seemed to look right through him, as though his presence was just another burden she could no longer bear. And then came the moment at Windsor Palace that no one could forget. A gathering of family, hushed and formal, where Andrew reached out his hand toward her, subtle, almost desperate. But Beatrice recoiled, not with anger, but with quiet finality. Witnesses described her as stepping back just enough to leave his hand hanging in the air, a gesture that felt heavier than any words. It was a fleeting moment, barely noticeable to the cameras, but those who saw it understood what it meant. Behind closed doors, the silence between them only deepened. Insiders spoke of a private confrontation in which Beatrice demanded answers he either could not or would not give. Rather than reassuring her, Andrew reportedly turned away, refusing to engage, retreating into his own silence. That refusal widened the emotional chasm between them, leaving her to carry her questions alone. Andrew, who once thrived under pressure, now appeared to falter. He began avoiding lengthy conversations, slipping into isolation, even from those closest to him. His usual defiance and confidence seemed to evaporate, replaced by a quietness that unsettled even his staunchest allies. And still, he said nothing publicly, offering no explanation, no comfort, not even to the daughter who had always stood by him. But Beatrice wasn't navigating this storm alone. she had a sister caught between loyalty and love. Where Beatrice mourned loudly, Eugenie chose to heal quietly and hold the family together with invisible threads. In the shadow of her sister's heartbreak, Eugenie became the silent force no one noticed, but everyone relied on. While the world fixated on Beatrice's public withdrawal and Andrew's isolation, Eugenie moved carefully, bridging the chasm that had opened between them. She made no statements, gave no interviews, and offered no expressions of outrage or defense. But her actions, deliberate and understated, spoke louder than words. She positioned herself beside both Beatrice and Andrew, never abandoning either. When Beatrice locked herself away, it was Eugenie who slipped in quietly with warm food, gentle words, and hours of silent company. She reminded her sister that she was not alone, that family, however fractured, was still hers to claim. But her presence didn't stop there. To the public eye, she dutifully attended royal events with Andrew, walking in with her usual grace, allowing cameras to capture a facade of unity. Her steady appearances reassured the public that the York family still stood, even if behind the curtain, everything was falling apart. Eugenie's role as mediator became increasingly clear to insiders. She was the one who kept conversations alive when they stalled, who softened sharp words and ensured that nothing, however painful, boiled over in public view. But this balancing act came at a cost. Those closest to her noticed the strain in her eyes, the moments when her composure faltered just long enough to betray her own doubts. Some wondered if she, too, carried secrets. Secrets that weighed on her as heavily as they did on Sarah or Beatrice. Her silence was not passive, it was protective. By refusing to take sides, she held what little remained of the family's dignity in her hands. Yet even she could feel the walls of the palace tightening around them all. The whispers grew louder, the speculation sharper, and Eugenie knew she was standing on ground that could give way at any moment. But behind palace gates, the stakes had grown higher than just family ties. This scandal now threatened the monarchy itself. For the monarchy, DNA wasn't just a science, it was a ticking time bomb. When the whispers turned into leaks, and the leaks into full-blown headlines, the palace found itself trapped in a crisis it could neither name nor control. Behind closed doors, the legal team sprang into action, drafting letters of warning and confidentiality, calling editors in hushed, urgent tones. Every effort was made to stem the tide, to keep the story contained before it swept away what little dignity remained. But with every passing hour, the cracks in the royal armor widened, and more of the truth slipped into public view. King Charles was briefed early in the morning, handed folders full of clippings, statements, and damage assessments. He listened, silent but visibly troubled, as his advisors outlined the chaos unfolding beyond the gates. Yet their advice was unwavering. Say nothing, do nothing. They argued that the monarchy's strength had always been its silence, its refusal to wade into public mud. But for Charles, this silence felt less like strategy and more like paralysis. Behind his quiet nods, something inside him began to doubt whether silence would be enough this time. Meanwhile, the royal public relations machine began its familiar choreography. News cycles were flooded with pictures of William and Kate smiling at charity events, attending royal galas, and visiting hospitals. Princess Catherine's tireless work and William's polished appearances became the story the palace wanted the world to see. Even stories about Harry and Meghan's distance from the family were deliberately circulated, anything to shift focus, anything to stop the question that now dominated every headline: where is Beatrice? That question grew louder and sharper with each day she remained hidden. For a woman born into a life of public duty, her absence was deafening. She missed scheduled appearances. She declined invitations. Even private events that she would normally attend in solidarity were met with her silence. It was as if she had simply vanished, leaving the royal family scrambling to explain her absence without revealing the truth. The press began to turn. Commentators who had defended the palace for decades now questioned their tactics. Reporters who once tread carefully now demanded answers. The people themselves, long conditioned to accept the monarchy's silences, grew restless. How long could they keep pretending nothing had happened? How long could Beatrice remain out of sight before the silence became its own kind of confession? And yet, amid the royal silence, one voice behind the throne was quietly pushing for healing, not headlines. She was once the outsider, now the calm in the storm, and Camilla wasn't about to lose another royal to silence. In a palace where everyone chose to look away, Camilla kept watching. She understood better than most what it felt like to be whispered about, to feel the sting of exclusion, to carry the weight of decisions others never forgave you for. And it was that understanding that made her step into the shadows of this crisis, not as queen, but as something far rarer in those halls, a voice of empathy. She urged Charles to do what no advisor dared recommend: meet Beatrice not as a monarch summoning his niece, but as a man sitting down with a young woman whose world had just been shattered. Camilla reminded him, quietly but firmly, that compassion, not control, was what Beatrice needed now. Every day the palace delayed, the wound grew deeper, the silence more corrosive. Camilla could see it, she could feel it, and she would not let it fester without at least trying to heal it. Her own past served as proof of what silence could destroy. Years of being cast aside, ridiculed, mistrusted, Camilla had endured all of it and clawed her way back into the family's good graces. Now she saw her younger niece teetering on that same edge, and she refused to let her fall without a hand to hold. In private moments, she spoke of her own exile to Charles, painting a picture of what awaited Beatrice if they continued pretending nothing was wrong. And in those conversations, she warned him, "She won't stay quiet forever. None of us really can." Camilla pressed for what she called honest talk, a radical departure from the royal handbook of dignified avoidance. She wanted Charles to listen, not defend, not instruct, but simply listen to Beatrice's pain and confusion. Because if they didn't confront the truth now, Camilla feared it would calcify into resentment, the kind that no apology could ever undo. It wasn't a strategy for her, it was survival. It was a woman who knew the cost of silence, begging her husband not to pay it again, not with family, not with Beatrice. And though she wore the crown now, Camilla never forgot what it was to be invisible, to scream inside and never be heard. She would not let that happen to Beatrice, not if she could stop it. But while the palace was planned behind closed doors, one man had already stood by Beatrice's side without cameras or conditions. While the monarchy looked the other way, he looked her straight in the eyes and never flinched. When the walls of the palace grew colder, when even her own father could not bring himself to speak the words she longed to hear, Edoardo stood beside her, unshaken. He became the one place where her truth was not a scandal but a reality she was allowed to feel. In the chaos of royal expectation and family silence, he reminded her of who she was, not as a princess, not as a daughter of a crown, but as Beatrice, a woman deserving of peace. Through every tear, every sleepless night, Edoardo held her hand and urged her to put herself above the traditions that had suffocated her. He told her plainly that no throne was worth the price of her soul, that no title could replace her dignity, and it was his quiet insistence, his unwavering calm, that gave her the courage to finally choose herself. Together, they decided it was time to leave London behind. They moved to the countryside, not in exile, but in pursuit of something real, something untouched by royal eyes. It was there that she began to breathe again, away from the scrutiny, away from the questions that had hollowed her out. Edoardo reminded her daily that her worth was not tied to her bloodline, that her value did not depend on DNA or royal approval. He told her stories of his own family, his own quiet traditions, where love meant more than protocol, where children learned kindness before they learned how to curtsy. Together, they began to build a different kind of life. Their children were raised not to see themselves as heirs to a broken story, but as individuals with choices, with hearts full of freedom. Edoardo made sure their home was not about legacy, but about laughter, teaching them that respect was something earned, not inherited. And as Beatrice felt the warmth return to her own heart, she knew she had stepped off the stage she'd been born onto. She no longer needed the approval of a family that had turned its back on her. She no longer needed the validation of a nation that debated her worth. With Edoardo, she found something rarer than any crown she found herself. Beatrice had walked away from royal expectations, but what would this mean for the future of the monarchy? Once the quietest royal, Beatrice is now sending the loudest message without saying a word. Her silence is not just the silence of a woman wounded by betrayal, it is the silence of a storm gathering at the edge of the monarchy. What began as personal heartbreak has grown into something much larger, an unmistakable crack in the foundation of the institution itself. By withdrawing, Beatrice has done what no speech could accomplish. She has forced the palace to confront its own fragility. Every absence, every unanswered question, reminds the world that even a crown can fracture under the weight of truth. Inside the palace, her silence has become its own kind of threat. Advisors speak in whispers, fearful that the longer she remains silent, the more power she gains over the narrative. For the monarchy, The danger is no longer simply about one princess's identity. It's about what else might come to light if others find the same courage she has. Already, there are murmurs among younger royals who see in Beatrice's choice a kind of freedom they've never dared to imagine, and the fear that others might follow her lead, walking away, choosing truth over duty, is palpable. Beyond the palace gates, the public watches her with a mixture of empathy and admiration. Once criticized as quiet, dutiful, unremarkable, Beatrice has become something else entirely, a symbol of quiet rebellion. People see in her not weakness, but extraordinary strength. They see the cost of silence and the bravery of walking away from it. As public opinion shifts, more voices rise in support of her right to the truth, to her own story, to a life not defined by gilded lies. Her journey has begun to redefine what it means to be royal. No longer does royalty rest solely on bloodlines and titles. In her, it becomes about courage, about the willingness to stand alone in a room full of history and say no. Her departure has changed the conversation about legacy, dignity, and what it truly means to belong. And as she turns her back on the palace, stepping into the life she's chosen, rather than the one imposed upon her, the world is left to wonder if her quiet rebellion is only the beginning. Will Princess Beatrice's quiet rebellion reshape the crown forever? Or is this just the beginning of a new kind of royalty? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.